Okay, I think I'll start. Hello, everyone, and good to see you all. Thank you for being here. I'm going to talk tonight about how a monk can help when you are dying or just dead. And this is not a Dharma talk. It's actually an offering of information, though it won't be completely bereft of Dharma. It's mostly to offer you information about what's available. And this came out of our conversations on aging and dying that some of us have been having. And it just struck me as good. Some of you will know all about this already, and even more than I'm going to say tonight. And some of you will know almost none of it. And so it just seemed good for us to all be aware of what's available so we can avail ourselves of it if we want to, with no obligations. I think the first thing I want to say is how important this time is when we're dying and in the period of time just after we've died. We talked a lot about that when we had our January intensive on death and dying. And I'm not going to go into all of that now because that would be the whole evening or more. But I can't stress enough, this is a really big transition in our lives, really big. And it's a transition we actually don't know very much about, in spite of the fact that religions posit all sorts of things about what happens as we're dying, and especially what happens after we're dead. But, what religions say about it are so different that I don't quite know who to believe. And I do have a thought or two, but I'll save them for a bit later. But in any case, I think this is a time when it's really important for us to give attention to it, to bring our awareness to it, to be willing to talk about it, to not be it's something we just sort of muddle our way through or pretend isn't happening when it's happening. This is also a time when our families become very involved in our lives, I have found. And part of what that means is that sometimes a monk is a bit superfluous because the family doesn't know what to do with a monk. And the family has, really wants to be with their loved one and do what they can for their loved one. And that all makes perfect sense. This can also be true of close friends. That all makes perfect sense. So none of this is a complaint. It's just a shift I notice, that when somebody's dying, sometimes a monk can be a bit irrelevant, but not always. I also want to say that almost everything I'm going to mention tonight, a layperson can do as well. This is not necessarily the prerogative of a monk, though a monk may have some training in all of this. But a layperson can pretty much do everything except be celebrant at certain ceremonies. I think that the most important thing that can be offered during this time of our lives is friendship and stillness. And of course, those are things that anyone can offer. But for me, that's what I would want to offer, is friendship and stillness. Often, the best thing we can do is just sit together quietly. And what we offer is our presence, our loving presence. And what I think is most helpful to someone who's dying is the offering of love and the offering of presence. So we can just sit there quietly loving them. I'm afraid I almost said loving them to death. Not very appropriate. Anyway, so some of the things that a monk can do, we can meditate together with the person who's dying, with family and friends who are there. We can create an altar in the space where the person is dying if there isn't one already there. And sometimes a special altar is created that has things on it that the dying person is particularly fond of or that are particularly meaning to them in their spiritual lives. We can recite scriptures and invocations. We can offer merit. And I really want to encourage you not to discount this. The offering of merit is something that can be done from anywhere, and still be effective. And sometimes I feel like the offering of merit is a cheap out. I'll offer merit and then I don't have to do anything else. But in fact, the offering of merit is a very powerful offering. And it's something we can always do. And I think it's really important that none of us discount its value and do, in fact, offer merit. It occurs to me to mention that I was once supposed to be with someone who was dying who had explicitly asked me to be there. This is, in my time at Shasta Abbey. And when this person was in fact dying, I couldn't be there. I could not get there. And I went to Reverend Jisho and mentioned my consternation at the situation. And he said, "The mind is so big, it doesn't matter where you are, you're still there." And I found that response actually very powerful and very helpful. So offer merit from wherever you are. We can also talk to and reassure the family. And especially as monks, we can respond to whatever arises spiritually for the dying person. We can offer ongoing support, spiritual support especially, throughout the course of an illness, throughout the course of the failing of old age, and then respond to whatever concerns a dying person has. Perhaps they do a bit of a life review and there's a need to make amends. We can help and support that. So those are some of the, I think kind of obvious things that we can do to help. And then there is the matter of the exhortations. Some of you are very familiar with the exhortations. Some of you will probably never have heard of them. But it's traditional in many forms of Buddhism to read exhortations to the dying and the dead. And these exhortations are meant to guide the dying person into death and through the bardo. The bardo is the in-between state between dying and rebirth. And the Tibetans are particularly sophisticated at this and have very elaborate ceremonies and traditions and exhortations that they read to the dying. I used to think that this was phenomenally important and must be done. And I'm less sure of that now, maybe because I don't really know what happens after we die. And so I'm not absolutely sure what's needed. The exhortations, on the one hand, are incredibly beautiful, and on the other hand, worry me just a little bit because they begin with bright light. And and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute, but well, as Reverend Master Vivian said, after we're actually pronounced clinically dead, when we're pronounced clinically dead, we're not really dead yet altogether. We're still dying, actually. And beyond even just that dying that happens after we're clinically dead, consciousness and karma continue after our death. And Reverend Master Vivian said that when we die, we actually go through the reverse process that we did when we were living. When we're living, we start far away from the unborn and get closer and closer to it. When we die, we're right there with the unborn and we get further and further away, which I thought was an interesting way to put it. So the exhortations, well, maybe I should say that the one thing I feel pretty sure of, and it may simply be that I want this to be true. I don't know why I think I know it's true, but my sense is that when we die, we meet the unborn. And it's very important not to turn away when we meet the unborn because of self-judgments or feelings of unworthiness or fear or for any other reason. And one of the main purposes, I think, of having a monk present at that time is that their faith can keep us on track, keep us within the unborn, in effect, with any luck. And so the exhortations begin with this entering into the unborn. And those are the first two exhortations in particular, I think are particularly important and very good to read at any death, pretty much, unless, I mean, if you're dealing with someone who's not a training Buddhist, you don't want to read them. But for a Buddhist who's died, I think they are very inspiring in terms of keeping one within the unborn at that point. And then the exhortations move to addressing any refusal to remain within the unborn that we might come to out of self-judgment, out of fear. In the exhortations describe the unborn as pure love. And they say, within pure, there is no judgment. And I think that's a very beautiful reminder. But if we don't think well of ourselves, if we judge ourselves negatively, if we get caught in all the things we did wrong in our life, we can move away from the unborn. And the exhortations are attempts to move us back. With each exhortation, and these are read about once, you read one every week until 49 days are up. And it's said that after 49 days, we're reborn. Of course, that time isn't set. And the whole issue of being reborn is there's a lot in it. It's not as simple as I, in this, body right here now, as I know myself, is reborn. It's not that simple. But in any case, the exhortations are always offering us an opportunity to return to the unborn, but they do so as circumstances become more and more difficult for us, because we step outside the unborn, and first we're shown loving deities and bodhisattvas, but then we're shown demons and that sort of thing, beings that appear to us as fearsome and unhelpful. In fact, they're trying to move us back to the unborn, maybe by scaring us back. But so the intention is always to move us back to the unborn, but the language of the exhortations becomes more and more frightening until finally we're guided through the process of taking rebirth in another womb. So the reading of the exhortations is something I think that can be very helpful, particularly the reading of the first two. After that, it's not so clear. And often it's felt that a person died at peace and they don't need any more exhortations. And reading for the first one or two is enough. So it takes a great deal of quiet reflection and intuition to know what's best to do in the case of any particular death. Now, just before somebody dies, there's a small ceremony that one can do that involves the reading of the first exhortation and the recitation of the Litany of the Great Compassionate One, offering incense, making bows. If a person wants that, I think it's a very beautiful thing to do. When somebody is actually dead, the first thing that we do is bathe the body. This is a pretty all-pervasive Buddhist tradition that I find to be very lovely, and it's actually one of my personal favorite things to be able to do, to physically touch this body and to wash it clean, is incredibly moving to me. So we bathe the body and then we dress it. It's nice if one can do these things before rigor mortis sets in, but not required. Nothing's required. And then there may be a cremation at which we can offer a ceremony. Usually that involves offering incense, asperging the person who has died, circumambulating the coffin while reciting scriptures, especially the adoration of the Buddha's relics. Now then there is a very large, somewhat long, formal ceremony that we do traditionally that consists in two parts. And one is the private funeral. That can actually happen right after the washing of the body, or it can happen along with the public funeral. And the private funeral, if it's with the public funeral, then everybody who's there is there. And if it's right after the person has died, it may just be a few people who are around. But in a private funeral, scriptures are recited, the body is asperged. That's sprinkling water on the body. There is a symbolic shaving. The bloodline and wagesa, if the person has them, are placed on the body or the ashes, and so is a rosary. So that's a kind of briefer ceremony to gather together, to purify the dead person and to gather together what is needed for the public funeral. At this point, a monk can also sit with the body, as can anyone else. And, it's sometimes said the body shouldn't be moved or disturbed in any way for 3 days, so that the person can finish dying and finish the processing of their karma. We don't follow that tradition anymore. Some traditions say 7 days, but we do the best we can. The public funeral is actually a beautiful ceremony. There are a number of verses that are read in the course of that ceremony that are very beautiful. Scriptures are recited. There's another symbolic shaving. The repentance verse is recited, and the person who has died is given the precepts. And some of you may, I'll save that for a bit. Let me shift gears. There are also memorials that can be done. A memorial is different from a funeral because it's a briefer ceremony. It doesn't consist in the sending off of the person who has died. It's a way of honoring them and offering them respect and letting them know that we're thinking about them after they have died. And it usually involves incense offerings and the recitation of scriptures. Scripture of Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, the Litany of the Great Compassionate One, and adoration of the Buddha's relics are the most common scriptures. And there are special days for memorials. Immediately after the death, 7 days later, 49 days later, a year later, that kind of thing. If you want to follow the specific tradition. Beyond that, a monk can offer ongoing support for family and close friends if that's wished, and can help with the setting up of an altar for the dead person in your home. or placing them on the altar you already have. Again, you don't need a monk for that, but it's something we can help with if you like. Now, so that's the kind of the basics of what we can do specifically and formally. And I should emphasize that I don't have to be the one who does them. You might prefer another monk. Some of you may have close relationships to other monks, and you may want them to do these things, or some of them. And that's absolutely as it should be. And I personally don't have any problem at all with that. I would completely support that. It's really important that whatever happens, it's within your wishes. And you also might prefer to have a funeral at Shasta Abbey. And they can do both the private and public funeral, or the private funeral can be done down here, and the public funeral can be done at the Abbey. The Abbey's no longer burying bodies, but they do bury ashes, or most commonly, they install ashes in the Kanzeon shrine, the Bodhisattva of compassion, which is to the right of the main altar at the Abbey. And that's part of the funeral ceremony, to actually take the ashes off of the main altar and carry them to the Kanzeon shrine and place them with an altar in front of them so that people can offer incense to the ashes, to you, to offer merit to you. So please know that those are also possibilities for you if you wish them. And I think, we here would do everything we could to facilitate that, if that would be helpful. I want to emphasize flexibility here, that all of this is extremely flexible. I've kind of outlined the formal traditions that are already in place, but they can be modified to fit any situation. For example, your family may be having a funeral or a memorial or a celebration of life or whatever they call it for you. They may not be interested in anything a monk can or might do, or they might be interested in having bits and pieces of the memorial ceremony incorporated into their whatever it is that they're doing. And they also might just ask the monk to say something at the funeral, during that part of a funeral where people are offering their thoughts about the person who has died. So whatever is asked of a monk by the family or whoever else might be responsible for the person who has died, it can be anything that the family wants, and it's their wishes. The wishes of the person who have died, I believe, need to be respected first, if we know what those wishes are, and then the wishes of the family. And which brings me to one other thing, which is that if you have a specific request, it's better to make it known before you die, because after you die, none of us can guess. So however it works for you, make sure that someone knows what it is that you want. I also want to say that, at the Abbey, they're pretty strict about that funeral ceremony and how it proceeds. But lately, they've loosened up a little bit and allowed someone to play a piece of music at the end of the ceremony, or to say something about the deceased at that point. But to my mind, even when we do a full funeral and a formal funeral, it's completely possible to include remembrances from family and friends, and there's no reason not to do that. That seems to have become a pretty important part of funerals for us these days, and so that is certainly possible. Also, about the cremation, that's my other favorite part. I love to be at cremations. I think they're absolutely stunning events. But often the family doesn't want to be at a cremation. And a monk can go to a cremation by themselves or with a few other friends, or some of us in the group, however it works out, whatever the person who has died wants, and do a ceremony at the cremation without the family. That's certainly possible. Sometimes it's hard for the family to have a monk, and sometimes a dying person doesn't want a monk around. And so all of that is fine. It's what resonates with the person who is dying. And if you aren't around for whatever reason, there are things that you can do from a distance. Meditation, most obviously, offering merit, as I said earlier, reciting scriptures. And one can also recite scriptures in the room of someone who's dying. I think that it's the friendship of the heart that transcends time and place. So again, like Reverend Jisho said to me, it doesn't matter where you are. You can make your offering and it's heard and it's effective. If there's anything you want from me, you can let me know ahead of time. That would be most helpful. And that can include, you say to me, Reverend Vivian, when I die, would you please call Reverend so-and-so and ask them to come and do the ceremonies, or whatever you want. You can just, you can ask me to be the person who passes it on, the go-between, if that's helpful to you. And that said, we often don't know what we want or what is good to do until we're actually in the midst of it. And this is sort of the conundrum of dying. Because anything we don't say explicitly before we die, the people who are still alive aren't going to know about. And I think this requires, at the time that somebody's dying, a lot of listening. And listening not just to words. Maybe all the listening has got nothing to do with words, but listening and responding from intuition. It may be that what occurs to us to do at those times come almost completely from listening and intuition. And it just comes to us to do something and we do it. Turns out to be the right thing. I'm happy to talk to any of you individually about any of this if you'd like to, and I can offer more detail if we were to do that, if you would like it. And I think that's what I have to say for tonight. Oh, I have to tell you one thing. This is a bit of an aside, but it's right to the point. Reverend Koten, dear Reverend Koten, used to cite this scene in Indiana Jones. Temple of Doom, or I don't know what, those movies, Indiana Jones movies. So he's entering into a cave where, something's going to happen that's either going to save things or destroy everything. And I'm sorry, I don't have the details. But the instructions he gets from on high, whatever that is, some mysterious force, are walk straight ahead. Do not look left or right. Do not look down. Do not stop. And I offer this as the perfect way to die. Walk straight ahead. Do not look to left or right. Do not look down. Do not stop. Of course, in the movie, he's walking through this cave, passages in a cave, and he comes to an abyss. But he can't stop. So he has to keep walking. He has to walk right over the abyss. And the abyss turns out to be like a 1-inch deep pool of water on the floor of the cave that's reflecting the ceiling. And it looks like an abyss, but it's not. Anyway, for what that is worth, I find that to be wonderful advice. I'll stop there.